I've already acknowledged that some might view my time with Sandy as only half in, half out of a home, on the perilous boundary between inside and outside. It's one of those difficult ones theoretically, like how long is a severed rat's tail. But there was a time I almost landed myself a true inside life. One nobody could question, with authentic housecat credentials. It was probably the closest I've ever come, and likely ever will, so close I could even taste the kitty stew on the spoon. This time there wasn't just a small window of opportunity, but an actual entrance door swung wide. And it happened on my second Monster Moon, which is a very strange night the hindwalkers here have. You know Monster Moon has arrived the moment the ghastly turnips appear, glowing with fire, sitting on balconies and porches like guards, all the way to the horizon. There must be, I don't know the exact number, I'm no expert at counting, but the stars in the sky above my alley, that's how many turnips come out to line Gloomtown, lighting it up with their eerie glow. And the creepiest thing is the fact these turnips have critter-like faces, with eyes and snout holes, toothy grins and snarls. I've never seen anything like this in kitchens or rolling off market stands. They're easily the most vicious-looking vegetables you'll ever come across.
And you can imagine my shock the first time I saw them. Everything I thought I knew about vegetables seemed to fall apart. These ones seemed like living critters all of a sudden, predatory even, and handy lamps at the same time.
Eventually I got close enough to see they weren't reacting to me at all though. Not even a twitch, just like regular vegetables. And I finally decided these ghastly turnips were just all show, the result of people fooling with their food. And so what happens on Monster Moon is this. With their turnips out and glowing, instead of going back to their own dens after dark, the porkskins patrol the streets and visit any other house dens they find. There they recite strange rhymes and songs and come away with cakes.
There are two types on these patrols, the normal people disguised in dark hooded robes and capes, and the others who wear similar false hides but are badly deformed. Their faces might have hideous bloated features, or sometimes cracked skin like crumpled paper and only slits for eyes, or even look like a dried old critter head with the skull box showing through. My first Monster Moon, as if the turnips weren't disturbing enough, I was also running around horrified by the others until I came to my senses, or started paying a bit more attention to my senses, and realized the creatures all smelled like porkskins no matter how they looked. Which means they were really just monster porkskins, the worst freaks of the litters. That's not a good thing, obviously, but it means they're not entirely different beasts and I do have a good understanding of what to expect. I don't know exactly where these freaks live, but I'm suspecting they're locked away in buildings most of the year, probably with leashes thick as horse reins and pillowcases over their heads to muffle the shrieks and hide their demented faces.
And on Monster Moon they're let outside for a while, the way people take their hounds out so they don't bark the walls down or flood the floor with drool. It seems like the entire night is largely about scavenging for food. And I suppose what's happening is, it's like how Carl the Critter Carver or other decent hindwalkers will hand some food off to the four-leggers out here to thank them for their street work. But this time all the freaks of the town are served, the real underbelly of society, even under the underbelly of my backstreets.
I don't see why these scummy misfits deserve anything, actually, but this is porkskin society, remember, where up is down and down is up.
Another difference is that the people aren't given proper meat treats in their hands, just little round cakes instead. I'm not the biggest cake eater, but these are very buttery and end up being dropped about the place like feathers from a spooked flapper. It's mainly what got me interested in the event, actually.
I do think it's unfortunate Carl wasn't in charge of Monster Moon, because then instead of fresh cakes, it would be fresh carcasses littered everywhere, or at least Hefty Fritz chunks, but he's got a shop to run.
As for the more regular robed people joining in, I suspect it's just the town rabble being opportunists. Hindwalkers are famous for it.
Whether it's keeping bark beasts for guard duty or flappers to steal their eggs, or selling every other critter's kids in shop windows, they can't help themselves. As I mentioned, they're the kind of creatures that will skin an animal and wear it on their back rather than grow and groom their own fur coat. Doesn't that say it all?
On Monster Moon, it's best to lay low for most of the evening, waiting for all the monstrosities to finish their cake patrols before doing my own. You have to be cautious with a crowd like this. It's just basic meowcraft.
This particular night, my Cooper eyes were watching closely from within a cracked box crate near my alley, and it can be quite the interesting spectacle. I mean, you think you've seen it all, every kind of critter a shadow, shutter, and sewer can spit out. But then Monster Moon comes around and it really makes you realize just how grotesque and deranged the living world actually is, and also how lucky you are to be a plain old, well-proportioned purr.
So there I was, observing the robed rabble and waiting until the last stragglers passed. I could smell some dropped cakes and crumbs already and the streets were emptying nicely. Now, on my first monster moon, I'd rushed to grab any morsel I could find as soon as possible. But I came across some sweet-toothed gnars out in the open nibbling cakes, and that's when I realized these cakes could make good mouse-trapping bait, as long as Morty the furred multi-trap could get in pounce range.
See, I've really got 3 traps at my disposal, the main jaws, then the 2 front paws, each as deadly as any gold-stick-loaded snapper. But in a scuffle, I also have 2 emergency traps with the rear paws. It's a shame I couldn't grow a claw or 2 on my tail tip, because that would make 6. Earwigs have a pair back there, so it's not as stupid as it sounds. So anyway, I worked out it was best to wait a little longer, until the Gnar's own patrols had started, so as to catch a warm meal at the same time. That was my plan this monster moon. But in Gloomtown, even plans set in stone can crumble off a building cornice and knock you out cold. The problem was that Mr. Tum wasn't being very cooperative that night, which happens when he's been pretty neglected.
He was urging me to forget the mousetrapping and just secure some cake flesh as soon as possible. I tried to reason with him, telling him to wait a little longer and get a bigger feed. But then he started grumbling and growling away and even trying to starvation scare me, saying that if I didn't snatch up those cakes now, we'd both end up with nothing.
It's very hard to reason with Mr. Tum when he's in that mood. And of course, my surly sidekick Solitude does nothing to help, keeping his distance and never uttering a thing in support. I also explained about keeping low until the monsters were all gone. But again, he wasn't having any of it and said he couldn't sense a single one close by, that in fact they were possibly all just a figment of my imagination.
Obviously, Mr. Tum has no eyes or ears or snout holes, so what does he know? But just to shut him up, I crawled out of my crate and started my prowl earlier than intended.
I did soon sniff out some decent-sized crumbs and eventually a good chunk of cake. I'd been too impatient though, too weak on Mr. Tum, and soon paid the price.
As I was walking down the pavement, a fair way from my place by then, a group of figures began to follow me, almost stalking, and one had a long pole with something on the end I couldn't quite make out, but by the size of the silhouette, it could have been a yapper dog in a net.
For a second, I thought this was some dog catcher unit in disguise for Monster Moon, hoping to nab some drool demons unawares, and that this was just a case of mistaken identity, thinking I was some skinny lap pooch on the run, who'd once rolled in an old fireplace and got himself a soot coat.
I slowed up for a closer look back, giving them a chance to realize their mistake and maybe even toss one of the cakes they were finished with. But I didn't see overalls, just robes. And that pole had no net attached, but instead a great big horse skull. I'd never skinned a dead clopper, but I had plenty of experience with skullbox anatomy on smaller critters and knew where all the bits went. And the holes were all in the right place for a horse. There was no doubt about it. Now, you have to understand that this may have been my second Monster Moon, but it was still Monster Moon after all, and it's very hard to think straight with the deranged things going on everywhere, like freak-faced people walking around with great horse skull boxes on poles.
So my second thought was that these mad hindwalkers had gone and butchered the ice cream clopper. My heart sank. How was the ice cream going to be delivered now? Also, that horse was a decent critter really, and had never stomped even one of my skittled scoops or ever tried.
So these hindwalkers had been off catching horses, not dogs, and were now hunting cats instead of cakes like they should be. It took me back to my first Monster Moon where I had absolutely no idea what was happening for most of it. And now I lingered far too long staring fright-eyed at this madness, trying to put it all together. Yes, a black cat, one yelled. It's a dead soul. Catch him.
I sprung down the footpath in confusion, realizing that this was no mistake. I was now dealing with cat catchers. Naturally, I was too quick for them, but they didn't give up. Even after my show of feline prowess and a few hellacious hisses at distance, eerily echoed too, they kept coming.
And I started getting pretty angry thinking about the deterioration of society and all. A society that allows dog catching to practically disappear and supports the capture of meowfolk in its place, and even the killing of ice cream cloppers. Then, to make matters worse, now the others joined the chase, monsters and freaks laughing hysterically, looted cake crumbs flying from their deformed mouths. The whole lurking lunatic horde had turned on me. As I ran, robes seeped from every street and shadow. I'm sure some even rose from the drains.
The ghastly turnips themselves seemed to be goading me with their crooked, cackling faces, trying to spotlight my coat with their flaming glow as I fled, desperate for shadow cover.
And though I could normally outbound all comers, the horde was closing in on all sides, even from up ahead.
The nearest side street was half a block or so, but it felt like the end of the world. I dodged around robed legs and gnarled hands and swiping sleeves at full stride, lamp posts flicking past, whiskers humming.
And finally I made it to the dark detour and shot within, feeling relieved, back in my habitat. But of course not every alley is my territory in this town, and deep within I smelled disaster and dug my pads into the pavement, skidding into a turn. 3 mottled mutt brutes came roaring out from the deep shadows to greet me. I had about 2 tail whips to weigh up my odds. A crazed horde of hind-walking freaks or 3 death-breath snap-trapping jaws. And trust me, you never pick the dogs. But you also never pick a straight-line sprint in a doggone cat chase. Even at top stray speed, it'll be too close to call. With the head start, they were on me too quick and I had to improvise and shoot to the side wall, then vertical leap to the sill of a boarded-up window. And the bark beasts bounded over to block my escape, completely surrounding me.
Snouts were snapping and the paws scraping off wall paint as I bashed into the wooden window, desperate for a way through. I looked up at the double-story building walls with blacked-out windows above, likely too low for any cat gods to occupy. I knew, and so there were no noble silhouettes in sight. I was on my own, for sure, a lone lurker in the wrong lane.
The dogs resembled some 3-headed monstrosity in a town square fountain, breath fumes blasting forth. And the staggered barks pounded right through me, bouncing off the walls in a chaotic chorus.
And it hit me then, the hopelessness of my position and how it had all happened so fast. One wrong turn out here and lives can hit a climax. I'd seen it so many times with critters in my sights, happy-go-lucky or flighty as a flapper. One moment dreaming of tomorrow, the next being laid to rest in my jaws. And now, perhaps, it was my turn. It wasn't how I expected it to be. But if it was going to be the end, in a way it was fitting. A last lone stand in a dead-end alley, surrounded on all sides, gut-wrenched with fear while wrenching the life out of yesterday's sandwich meat, blades drawn and lashing till the end, till the very last cat life. No, I knew right then if this was it, I wasn't going to lay down without leaving my mark all over these drool demons. I'd live on in their scars, for the whole town to see. And one last night these backstreets would hear my battle cries, rocking the residents from sleep. I aimed my fangs, cocked my claw-lined paws, tail flailing its death dance, and prepared to strike.
Then, tat-a-tat-a-tat-tat-tat, tremendous hailstones came streaming down, pelting and distracting the hounds. The smell hit me, not hail but dried hound food.
Cat god intervention? I thought, sensing a glow above. Was it still possible? But looking straight up I saw instead some man pouring a box of mutt morsels out the window, as they popped around the alley like marbles from a spilled bag.
With the dogs now snapping at the snacks, I took my chance and leaped off, biting myself a falling morsel out of midair, never one to waste. Clearing the dogs, I hit the ground, skating over some bouncing treats, but righted the cart and then headed for lamplight.
2 dogs turned to chase, but gave up after a few steps and returned to slobber washing the alley pavement.
I was clear. With this lead, no critter on legs would catch me now.
And I heard the downpour cease. That man may not have been a cat god, but knowing they work in mysterious ways, part of me wondered if they hadn't played a part in that event, not just saving my hide, but keeping it knitted up nicely.
For instance, maybe the man was just going to toss a measly few, but a cat god paw managed to rip a chunk out of that box and send down a stream. You just never know. And so I ran back out of Near-Death Alley and took a left down the pavement, and with the whole hound attack had almost forgotten about the original threat. But the hooded hindwalkers had scattered enough by then to help me evade another assault. You're probably thinking how after that whole triple hound ambush it was time for me to find some brick wall and notch a life off my tally. Well, let me just say that while it would have seemed a certain brush with death for some hapless critters, for a razor-clawed alley acrobat like myself, it's not so simple. Was it a bloody close call, caught between 3 rabid jaws and an impenetrable wall? Yes. But a certain brush with death? That's tough to say. To be honest, I'm a little torn on the issue. But since I don't have a single rip on the hide to show for it all, I have to give myself the benefit of the doubt here.
Trust me, if I'm sure about a life being lost, dead sure, I'll gladly scratch a life not just on some dirty bricks, where a hard rain could erase the evidence, but on my very own den doorway where the sofa frame shows.
Until then, though, I can't be throwing lives away just to be generous, like I'm some butcher shop critter carver with an endless supply of bodies.